The dust swirled around the wheels of the stagecoach as it lurched to a violent stop. Gunshots echoed across the desert landscape, followed by the harsh voices of men demanding valuables. Inside the coach, passengers cowered in fear, but none more so than the young woman pressed against the window, her emerald dress now torn and dusty. Catalina Rodriguez clutched her small leather satchel to her chest, knowing it contained the last of her family's money. She had been traveling from San Francisco to the small frontier town of Cedar Falls, hoping to start fresh after her father's death had left her with nothing but debts and broken dreams. The outlaws outside grew more aggressive, their leaders, voice cutting through the desert air like a blade, from behind a cluster of rocks about 50 yards away. Jackson Cole watched the scene unfold. He had been tracking this particular gang of road agents for 3 weeks, ever since they had robbed the bank in Tombstone and killed 2 innocent people in the process. His weathered hands gripped his Winchester rifle as he calculated the distance and angles. 4 men, all armed, and at least 6 passengers in the coach. Jackson had been a bounty hunter for 8 years, ever since he returned from the war to find his ranch burned and his family gone. The frontier had hardened him into a man who lived by his wits and his gun, trusting no one and caring little for anything beyond his next bounty. But something about the terror in the young woman's face stirred, something deep within him that he thought had died long ago. The gang leader, a scarred man named Dutch Morrison, yanked open the coach door and began dragging passengers out one by one. When he reached for Catalina, she recoiled, pressing herself further into the corner of the coach. Dutch's cruel laugh echoed across the desert as he grabbed her wrist, pulling her from the safety of the coach into the blazing afternoon sun. Well, what do we have here?" Dutch sneered, his tobacco-stained teeth visible as he smiled wickedly. "Looks like we got ourselves a real lady. I bet Daddy paid good money for that pretty dress." Catalina's voice trembled as she spoke, her slight Spanish accent adding a musical quality to her words despite her fear. "Please, I have very little money. Just let us go." Dutch's companions laughed as they continued robbing the other passengers. One of them, a thin man with dead eyes, approached Catalina with obvious intentions that made Jackson's blood boil. The bounty hunter had seen enough. Moving with the silence of a predator, Jackson positioned himself behind the rocks. His first shot dropped Dutch's lookout before the man even knew death was coming. The second shot shattered Dutch's gun hand, sending his weapon spinning into the dust. The third shot came so quickly after the second that it sounded like an echo, dropping another outlaw before he could draw. "Drop your weapons." Jackson's voice boomed across the desert, carrying the authority of a man who had faced death countless times and emerged victorious. Dutch and his remaining companion looked wildly around, unable to locate the source of the deadly accurate gunfire. "Show yourself, you coward," Dutch shouted, cradling his bleeding hand while using his good arm to hold Catalina against him. As a human shield, or the lady dies. Jackson emerged from behind the rocks, his rifle trained on Dutch's head. At 32, he was tall and lean, his dark hair touched with premature gray at the temples. His blue eyes held the coldness of winter storms, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who had spent years under the harsh desert sun. Everything about him spoke of danger and competence. "Let her go, Morrison," Jackson said calmly, never taking his eyes off the outlaw leader. "Your boys are dead and you're bleeding out. This can end easy or hard, but it's going to end." Dutch pressed his knife closer to Catalina's throat, a thin line of blood appearing where the blade touched her skin. "You know who I am? Bounty hunter. That means you know what I'm capable of." "I know you're worth $500 dead or alive," Jackson replied, his voice steady as stone. "And I know that knife gets any closer to her throat. You won't be worth anything at all." The standoff lasted only seconds, but to Catalina, it felt like hours. She could feel Dutch's desperation and the way his arm trembled around her waist. She could smell his fear mixing with sweat and whiskey. She looked at the tall stranger who had appeared like an avenging angel. She saw something different. Behind the coldness in his eyes, she glimpsed something that made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Dutch made his choice in a moment of panicked fury, shoving Catalina away while lunging for his dropped gun. Jackson's rifle spoke once more, the bullet finding its mark with deadly precision. Dutch Morrison would never threaten another innocent person. In the sudden silence that followed, Jackson slowly approached the stagecoach. The other passengers began emerging from their hiding places, talking excitedly among themselves about their rescue. But Jackson barely heard them. His attention was focused entirely on the young woman who stood in the desert dust, her hand pressed to the small cut on her throat. "Are you hurt badly?" he asked, his voice gentler than Catalina had expected from a man who had just killed 3 people without apparent remorse. "No, it's just a scratch," she replied, studying his face intently. "You saved us. You saved me." Jackson felt something shift inside his chest, something he couldn't quite identify. "Just doing what needed doing, ma'am." "My name is Catalina," she said softly, extending her hand to him in a gesture that seemed both formal and intimate. "Catalina Rodriguez." When Jackson took her hand, he felt a shock that had nothing to do with static electricity. Her skin was soft, despite the harsh journey, and her touch seemed to awaken parts of himself he had thought were buried forever. "Jackson Cole," he replied, holding her hand perhaps a moment longer than propriety demanded, as the sun began to set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Neither Jackson nor Catalina could have imagined how this chance encounter would change both their lives forever. The stagecoach limped into Cedar Falls 3 hours behind schedule, its passengers still shaken from their ordeal. Rode alongside on his black stallion, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. The town was smaller than Catalina had expected, with a main street lined by weathered wooden buildings and a few scattered houses extending toward the surrounding hills. As the coach came to a stop in front of the Wells Fargo office, Catalina gathered her belongings. With trembling hands, the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She had come to Cedar Falls with nothing but hope and the small amount of money in her satchel, planning to find work as a seamstress or perhaps a teacher. Now, in the fading light of evening, the town looked far less welcoming than she had imagined. Jackson dismounted and approached the coach. Offering his hand to help her down, the brief contact sent that same strange electricity through both of them, though neither spoke of it. Around them, other passengers were being greeted by family members and friends. But Catalina stood alone on the wooden sidewalk, looking lost and vulnerable. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" Jackson asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the uncertain way she looked up and down the street. "I had hoped to find a boarding house," Catalina replied, adjusting the small hat that had somehow managed to stay pinned to her dark hair throughout the ordeal. "Perhaps you could recommend one?" Jackson looked around the small town, knowing that the only boarding house was run by Mrs. Abernathy, a stern woman who would likely take one look at Catalina's torn dress and obvious Spanish heritage and find excuses to turn her away. The thought of this brave woman being subjected to such treatment made his jaw clench. "Mrs. Abernathy runs the only place in town that takes boarders," he said finally. "But she's particular about her guests." The meaning behind his words wasn't lost on Catalina. She had encountered such attitudes before during her journey west, and she straightened her shoulders with quiet dignity. "I see. Then perhaps I can find shelter at the church until I can make other arrangements." Before Jackson could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the saloon. A group of men stumbled into the street, clearly having spent the better part of the day drinking. Their leader, a heavyset man with a deputy's badge pinned crookedly to his vest, spotted Catalina and began walking toward them with exaggerated swagger. "Well, looky here," Deputy Hank Mosley called out, his words slurred, but his intent clear. "Got ourselves a new senorita in town. Pretty thing, too." Jackson stepped slightly in front of Catalina, his hand resting casually on the butt of his Colt. "Evening, Mosley. These folks have had a long day. Maybe you should head home and sleep it off."
"Oh."
Mosley's eyes narrowed as he recognized Jackson.
"Alex."
The two men had history, most of it unpleasant. "Bounty hunter," he spat. "This ain't none of your business. I'm just being friendly to the new resident. The lady doesn't look interested in your kind of friendship." Jackson replied evenly, though his voice carried an unmistakable warning. The tension between the two men was palpable, and Catalina found herself studying Jackson's profile in the lamplight. There was something magnetic about the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that radiated from him like heat from a forge. She had never met a man quite like him, and despite the danger of the situation, she felt safer standing behind him than she had since leaving San Francisco. Mosley's friends began spreading out, trying to flank Jackson, but the bounty hunter seemed unconcerned. His reputation in Cedar Falls was well established, and most men were smart enough not to test his skill with a gun. Unfortunately, Mosley had never been accused of being particularly smart. Maybe the little dove would prefer a real man to some saddle tramp who shoots folks in the back. Mosley sneered, reaching out to touch Catalina's arm. Jackson's hand moved faster than a striking snake, grabbing Mosley's wrist and twisting it until the deputy cried out in pain. "The lady said she wasn't interested," Jackson said quietly, his voice deadly calm. "I suggest you listen better. Can't treat a lawman like this." Mosley protested, though he made no move to resist as Jackson applied more pressure to his wrist. "I can treat a drunk like this," Jackson replied, "badge or no badge." Sheriff William Crawford emerged from his office, drawn by the commotion. It was an older man with graying hair and tired eyes, someone who had seen too much violence and wanted nothing more than to keep the peace in his town. He assessed the situation quickly, his gaze moving from Jackson to Mosley to the frightened young woman standing behind the bounty hunter. "That's enough, both of you," Crawford said firmly. "Hank, get yourself home before you do something stupid. Jackson, I appreciate you keeping the peace, but maybe it's time you moved along too." Jackson released Mosley's wrist but didn't step back. "I'll move along when I'm ready, Sheriff. Right now I'm making sure this lady gets to where she's going safely." Crawford nodded reluctantly. He didn't particularly like having a bounty hunter in his town, but he respected Jackson's reputation for honesty and his skill with a gun more. Importantly, he had heard about the stagecoach robbery from the driver and knew that Jackson had saved several lives that day, as Mosley and his friends stumbled away. Grumbling and making threats they lacked the courage to carry out, Crawford approached Catalina. "Miss, I'm Sheriff Crawford. I understand you had some trouble on the road today." "Yes, sir," Catalina replied, her voice steady despite everything she had been through. "Mr. Cole saved us from some very dangerous men."
Ass.
Crawford studied Jackson with new respect. "That's so? Well, I reckon the town owes you a debt of gratitude." "No debt owed," Jackson said simply. Any man would have done the same. But even as he spoke the words, Jackson knew they weren't entirely true. 6 months ago, he might have waited to see how the situation played out before getting involved, might have calculated the odds differently, or decided that 6 passengers weren't worth the risk. But something about Catalina had changed his calculations completely, as if sensing his thoughts. Catalina looked up at him with those expressive dark eyes that seemed to see straight into his soul. "I don't think any man would have done what you did," she said softly. "I think it took someone very special." The words hit Jackson harder than any bullet ever had, piercing through the armor he had built around his heart over the years. For the first time since the war, he found himself caring about what someone thought of him, caring about someone other than himself. Sheriff Crawford cleared his throat, breaking the spell that seemed to have fallen over the two young people. "Miss, if you're looking for a place to stay, I might be able to help. My wife runs a small seamstress shop, and she's been looking for someone to help with the work. There's a room above the shop that comes with the job." Catalina's face lit up with hope and relief. "That sounds wonderful, Sheriff. When could I meet with her? How about right now?" Crawford smiled, the first genuine smile he had worn all day. "Mary's probably still working on Mrs. Peterson's wedding dress." As they began walking toward the seamstress shop, Jackson found himself following along, unable to simply ride away as he had planned. Something was happening to him, something that both thrilled and terrified him. For 8 years, he had lived for nothing but the next bounty, the next town, the next dollar. But now, walking behind this remarkable woman in the gathering darkness, he felt as if he was waking up from a long, dreamless sleep. 2 weeks had passed since Catalina arrived in Cedar Falls. She had settled into a comfortable routine, working for Mary Crawford at the seamstress shop. The small room above the shop had become her sanctuary, decorated with wild flowers. She picked on her morning walks and a few precious belongings she had managed to save from her former life in San Francisco. Jackson found himself inventing reasons to stay in town longer than necessary. He told himself it was because he was waiting for information about another bounty, or because his horse needed rest. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. Every morning he would ride past the seamstress shop just as Catalina was opening the shutters, and every morning she would wave at him with a smile that made his heart race. The townspeople had begun to notice the bounty hunter's extended stay, and opinions were divided. Some appreciated having such a skilled gunman around, especially with reports of increased outlaw activity in the surrounding territories. Others worried that Jackson's presence would attract the kind of trouble that Cedar Falls had always managed to avoid. Catalina had quickly proven herself invaluable to Mary Crawford's business. Her nimble fingers could create delicate embroidery that rivaled anything found in the finest shops of San Francisco. And her gentle manner with customers had brought in new business from women who had never before visited the shop. But it was her evening walks that had become the talk of the town, particularly because they often coincided with Jackson's presence on the main street. On this particular evening, Catalina finished her work later than usual, having spent extra time on a christening gown for the banker's new grandson. The sun was setting as she stepped outside, stretching her arms above her head to relieve the tension in her shoulders. She hadn't expected to find Jackson leaning against the post outside her shop, his hat pulled low over his eyes.
Good evening.
"Mr. Cole," she said, her pulse quickening at the sight of him. Over the past 2 weeks, their conversations had grown longer and more personal, though they still maintained a careful formality that seemed to protect them both from acknowledging the growing attraction between them. "Evening, Miss Rodriguez," Jackson replied, straightening and removing his hat. "Thought you might enjoy some company on your walk tonight. That is, if you don't mind the company of a saddle tramp." Catalina laughed, a musical sound that never failed to make Jackson smile. "I think we both know you're much more than that. Yes, I would enjoy the company very much." They began walking toward the edge of town, following the path that led to a small creek surrounded by cottonwood trees. It had become their favorite destination, a place where they could talk without the curious eyes of the townspeople watching their every move. The evening air was cool and pleasant, filled with the scent of sage and the distant sound of water flowing over rocks. "Mary told me today that she's never seen such beautiful needlework," Jackson said, glancing sideways at Catalina as they walked. "She says you're bringing in customers from 3 towns over." "I enjoy the work," Catalina replied modestly. "It reminds me of my mother. She taught me to sew when I was very young, before she died. She always said that a woman who could create beautiful things would never want for purpose in life." Jackson heard the note of sadness in her voice and felt a sudden urge to comfort her.
"Yo, tell me about her."
"She was the most beautiful woman in our village in Mexico," Catalina said, her eyes growing distant with memory. "My father fell in love with her the moment he saw her, and she with him. They eloped to California when she was 17 against both their families' wishes. They had 20 wonderful years together before the fever took her." "And your father?" Jackson asked gently. "He never recovered from losing her," Catalina said simply. "He tried, for my sake, but his heart was buried with her. When he died last year, I think it was as much from loneliness as from illness." Had reached the creek, and Catalina settled onto a fallen log that served as their usual bench. Jackson remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the water. He had never spoken to anyone about his own losses, but something about Catalina's openness made him want to share parts of himself that he had kept buried for years. "I had a family once," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of the flowing water. "A wife named Rebecca and a little girl named Emily. They were killed by Comanche raiders while I was away at war." Catalina's heart clenched at the pain she heard in his voice. She rose from the log and moved to stand beside him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I'm so sorry, Jackson." It was the first time she had used his first name, and the intimacy of it sent a shock through both of them. Jackson turned to look at her, and in her dark eyes he saw understanding and compassion that no one else had ever offered him. "I came home to find the ranch burned and them buried in the little cemetery outside town," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I joined the army again, then became a bounty hunter after that. I told myself it was about justice, about making sure bad men paid for their crimes. But mostly, it was about having a reason to wake up every morning. And now?" Catalina asked softly, her hand moving almost unconsciously to touch his arm. Jackson looked down at her small hand resting on his sleeve, then back up to her face. The moon had risen while they talked, casting a silver glow over her features, and making her look like something from a dream. "Now I find myself wanting to wake up for different reasons." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. They both understood that something profound was happening, something that could change both their lives forever, but they also understood the risks. Jackson was a man who lived by violence, whose very presence could bring danger to anyone he cared about. Catalina was a woman trying to build a new life, seeking stability and security after years of uncertainty. "Jackson," Catalina whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "What are we doing?" He reached up and gently touched her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender against her soft skin. "I don't know," he admitted. "All I know is that for the first time in 8 years, I feel like I'm alive again." Before either of them could think better of it, Jackson leaned down, and Catalina rose up on her toes, and their lips met in a kiss. That was both gentle and desperate. It lasted only a moment, but it changed everything between them. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Jackson immediately stepped back. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "You deserve better than a man like me." "Don't I get to decide what I deserve?" Catalina challenged, her eyes flashing with spirit. "Don't I get to choose what I want?" "You don't understand," Jackson said, his voice growing harsh as he tried to push her away for her own protection. "Men like me don't get happy endings. We don't get to have normal lives with good women like you. All I can bring you is danger and heartache." "And what about what you could bring me?" "That's good," Catalina demanded, refusing to be dismissed so easily. "What about kindness and protection, and the way you make me feel safe for the first time since my father died? What about the way you make me feel alive?" Jackson stared at her, torn between his desire to pull her into his arms and his certainty that doing so would only lead to disaster. "Catalina, you don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," she replied firmly. "I know that I care about you, Jackson Cole, and I think you care about me too." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. He did care about her more than he had ever cared about anything since losing his family. But that only made it more important that he protect her from the reality of his life. The next morning brought news that would test everything Jackson and Catalina had discovered about their feelings for each other. A telegram arrived at the sheriff's office reporting that the Mackenzie gang had been seen heading toward Cedar Falls, and they had good reason to believe Jackson was in town. The bounty hunter had killed 2 of their members 6 months earlier. They were coming for revenge. Sheriff Crawford found Jackson at the stable, preparing to leave town as he did every few days to check his traps and scout for new bounties. The older man's face was grim as he approached, the telegram crumpled in his weathered hand. "We need to talk," Crawford said without preamble, "and it ain't good news." Jackson read the telegram twice before folding it carefully and placing it in his shirt pocket. The Mackenzie gang was notorious throughout the territory, led by a man named Cole Mackenzie, who had no relation to Jackson despite sharing the same last name. They were killers and thieves who showed no mercy to anyone who crossed them, and they were known for targeting the families and friends of men who had wronged them. "How long do we have?" Jackson asked, his mind already calculating distances and possibilities. "Day, maybe 2 if we're lucky," Crawford replied. "They were spotted in Millbrook yesterday morning. That's a hard day's ride from here." Jackson's first thought was of Catalina, and the blood in his veins turned to ice. If the Mackenzie gang came to Cedar Falls looking for him, they wouldn't hesitate to hurt innocent people to draw him out. They would target anyone they thought he cared about, and by now, everyone in town knew about his feelings for the beautiful seamstress. "I'll ride out this morning," Jackson said, already moving to saddle his horse. "If I'm not here, they'll have no reason to bother the town. And if they catch up to you out there alone? Crawford asked, though he already knew Jackson had considered that possibility. Better me than innocent folks getting hurt because of my past, Jackson replied grimly. Besides, I've been taking care of myself for a long time. As Jackson finished saddling his horse, he heard footsteps approaching the stable. He turned to see Catalina walking toward them, her face pale but determined. She had obviously overheard enough of their conversation to understand what was happening. You're leaving, she said, and it wasn't a question. I have to, Jackson replied, unable to meet her eyes. There are men coming who want to hurt me, and they'll hurt anyone they think I care about to get to me. So your solution is to run away? Catalina's voice was steady, but Jackson could hear the hurt underneath her calm exterior. My solution is to protect the people of this town, Jackson said sharply, finally looking at her. That includes you. Sheriff Crawford sensed the tension between them and cleared his throat awkwardly. I'll leave you two to talk, he said, walking away from the stable. When they were alone, Catalina stepped closer to Jackson, her dark eyes blazing with emotion. This is exactly what you were talking about last night, isn't it? About men like you not getting happy endings. This is about keeping you safe, Jackson insisted, checking his rifle one more time to avoid looking at her. No, this is about you being afraid, Catalina said quietly. You're not running from those men. You're running from me, from us, from the possibility that you might actually deserve to be happy. Jackson's hands stilled on his weapon, her words hitting closer to the truth than he wanted to admit. Catalina, you don't understand. These men will do terrible things to get to me. They'll hurt you in ways you can't even imagine. Ah! And what if I'm willing to take that risk? She challenged. What if I'd rather face danger with you than safety without you? Jackson turned to face her fully, his expression tortured. You think you would, but you don't know what you're saying. You've never seen what men like the Mackenzie gang are capable of. I've seen what good men are capable of, Catalina replied, moving even closer to him. I've seen you risk your life for strangers. I've seen you be gentle and kind when you thought no one was watching. I've seen you try to push away the one person who cares about you because you think it's noble. It is noble, Jackson said desperately. It's the right thing to do. The right thing for who? Catalina demanded. For me, because I'm telling you right now that the right thing for me is for you to stay and fight. Not just the Mackenzie gang, but this fear you have of caring about someone again. Jackson felt his resolve wavering as he looked into her eyes. Every instinct he had developed over 8 years of living alone told him to mount his horse and ride away. But something deeper, something he had thought was dead, urged him to stay and fight for the woman who was offering him a chance at a life he had never expected to have again. If I stay, people could die, he said quietly. If you leave, you'll die inside, Catalina replied, just as quietly. And so will I. Before Jackson could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears. Both of them turned toward the entrance of the stable, where Sheriff Crawford appeared with a group of townsmen behind him. The men were armed and looked determined, though most of them had the pale complexion of people who spent more time behind store counters than in gunfights. Jackson Crawford called out, "We've been talking, and we've decided. This town has been good to you, and you've been good to us. If those outlaws want trouble, they'll find it here." Sheriff, these men aren't weekend drunks or cattle rustlers, Jackson warned. They're killers. Most of these men have never been in a real gunfight. Maybe not, replied Henry Morrison, the town's blacksmith and one of the few men present who looked truly comfortable with the rifle in his hands. But we've all got something worth fighting for. And we reckon you do too now. Jackson looked around at the faces of the men who had gathered to support him. Some were frightened, but all were determined. These weren't warriors or gunfighters. But they were good men who had decided that some things were worth the risk. Behind them all, he could see other townspeople gathering, women and children who had come to see what was happening. Besides, Crawford added with a slight smile, we've sent word to the territorial marshal. Should have some real help here by tomorrow night if we can hold out that long. Jackson felt something shift inside him. The same feeling he had experienced when he first took Catalina's hand 2 weeks ago. These people were offering him something he had never expected to find again. A place to belong, people to protect, a reason to stand and fight instead of running. He looked at Catalina, who was watching him with hope and fear warring in her expression. "If I stay, if we do this, there's no guarantee how it will end," he warned her. "There are no guarantees in life," she replied. "But there are choices, and I choose to face whatever comes with you." Jackson nodded slowly, his decision made. He began unsaddling his horse, his movements quick and efficient. "All right then. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. Sheriff will need lookouts posted on every road leading into town. Henry, can you and your boys set up some cover along Main Street?" As the men began dispersing to carry out Jackson's instructions, Catalina remained in the stable with him. When they were alone again, she moved close to him and placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" Jackson asked, covering her hand with his own. "For choosing to fight," she replied. "For choosing us." Jackson leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "I love you, Catalina," he said softly, the words coming easier than he had expected. "And that's exactly why I'm scared to death right now." "I love you too," she replied, standing on her toes to kiss his lips briefly. "And that's why I know we'll find a way to survive this." The Mackenzie gang arrived with the dawn. 7 hard men on tired horses who looked like they had ridden through hell to get to Cedar Falls. They stopped at the edge of town, studying the unusually quiet Main Street with the eyes of predators who sensed a trap. Cole Mackenzie himself was a tall, lean man with dead eyes and scars that told stories of violence and cruelty. Jackson watched them from his position behind the water trough in front of the saloon, his Winchester loaded and ready. Around him, the townsmen waited in their assigned positions, some more successfully hidden than others. Sheriff Crawford crouched behind the corner of his office, while Henry Morrison had positioned himself in the loft of his smithy with a clear view of the street. Catalina, it's supposed to be safely locked in the back room of the seamstress shop with Mary Crawford and several other women and children. But Jackson knew her well enough by now to suspect she wouldn't stay there if she thought she could help. The thought of her being anywhere near the coming violence made his hands shake with fear for the first time since he was a green recruit. In his first battle, Cole Mackenzie finally spurred his horse forward, riding slowly down the main street with his men spread out behind him. He was dressed in black from head to toe, and his voice carried clearly in the morning air when he finally spoke. "Jackson Cole," he called out, his words echoing off the wooden buildings. "I know you're here, bounty hunter. My sources tell me. You've grown mighty fond of this little town. Come out and face me like a man, and maybe I'll let these good people live to see another sunset." Jackson remained hidden, knowing that revealing himself too early would give Mackenzie's men the advantage. He had faced odds like this before, though never with so many innocent lives at stake. The plan was simple. Let the gang get into the middle of town, where they could be surrounded, then take them down as quickly as possible. "You killed my brother in Tombstone," Mackenzie continued, his horse prancing nervously as if sensing the tension in the air. "Shot him down like a dog in the street. That kind of insult can't go unanswered." From his hiding place, Jackson could see Deputy Mosley emerging from the jail, clearly drunk despite the early hour. The fool was going to ruin everything by trying to assert his authority at the worst possible moment. Jackson cursed silently as Mosley stumbled into the street, his badge glinting in the morning sun. "You men are under arrest," Mosley declared loudly, his words slurred, but his intention clear. "This is a peaceful town, and we don't want your kind here." Da-da-da-da-da. Mackenzie's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. "Well, boys, looks like we got ourselves a real lawman here." Without warning, his hand dropped to his gun and came up smoking. The shot echoed through the morning air, and Mosley crumpled to the ground, his life ending before he even understood what had happened. The death of the deputy, worthless as he had been, triggered the battle Jackson had hoped to avoid. Henry Morrison's rifle spoke first from the smithy loft, his bullet taking down one of Mackenzie's men before the outlaw could clear leather. The remaining gang members scattered, diving for cover behind barrels, posts, and anything else that might stop a bullet. Jackson rose from behind the water trough, his Winchester finding its first target before the man could reach the safety of the general store's porch. The townsmen opened fire from their positions, filling the air with lead and smoke. But it quickly became apparent that enthusiasm was no substitute for experience in a gunfight. Young Billy Patterson, the bank clerk who had volunteered despite his wife's protests, exposed to much of himself while trying to get a clear shot. A bullet from one of the remaining outlaws caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him to the ground behind the loading dock where he had taken cover. "Stay down and keep shooting," Jackson shouted to the townsman as he moved. From his position, using the chaos of the battle to advance on the outlaws' positions, he could see Mackenzie had taken cover behind an overturned wagon near the hotel, directing his men with hand signals while keeping his own gun busy. Sheriff Crawford had managed to work his way around to the side of the saloon, giving him a clear shot at two of the outlaws, who were pinned down behind a pile of lumber. His first shot went wide, but his second found its mark, dropping one of the men permanently. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was actually only minutes. When the smoke began to clear, 3 of Mackenzie's men were dead, and 2 more were wounded badly enough to be out of the fight. But Mackenzie himself was still very much alive and extremely dangerous. "Enough," the outlaw leader shouted, rising from behind his makeshift cover with a small figure clutched in front of him. Jackson's heart stopped when he saw that Mackenzie had somehow gotten his hands on Catalina, holding her against him with one arm while pressing his gun to her temple with the other. "Just like I thought," Mackenzie sneered. "The big tough bounty hunters got himself a weakness. Drop your weapons, all of you, or I'll paint this street with her brains." Jackson could see the terror in Catalina's eyes, but also something else: determination. She was trying to tell him something with her gaze, some plan or idea that might give them an advantage. But with Mackenzie's gun pressed against her head, Jackson couldn't risk anything that might get her killed. "Let her go, Mackenzie," Jackson said slowly, placing his rifle on the ground. "Your fight is with me, not her." "But she's so much more than just some random woman, isn't she?" Mackenzie taunted, pressing the barrel of his gun harder against Catalina's temple, making her wince. "I can see it in your eyes, bounty hunter. This little dove means everything to you, which means hurting her is the best way to hurt you." Around the street, the townsmen were lowering their weapons reluctantly, knowing they had no choice with Catalina's life hanging in the balance. Jackson felt the familiar cold rage building inside him, the same fury that had driven him through years of hunting dangerous men. But this time, it was mixed with something else. A love so powerful it threatened to consume him. "What do you want?" Jackson asked, though he already knew the answer. "I want you to suffer like I suffered when you killed my brother," Mackenzie replied. "I want you to watch someone you love die, knowing there's nothing you can do to stop it." "Your brother was a killer and a rapist," Jackson said evenly, trying to keep Mackenzie talking while he looked for any opportunity. "He got what he deserved, maybe so." Mackenzie agreed with a shrug, but he was still family. Family debts have to be paid. That's when Catalina made her move. Jackson saw her hand moving slowly toward the small sewing scissors she always kept in her apron pocket. In one quick motion, she drove the sharp points backward into Mackenzie's thigh, while simultaneously dropping her full weight toward the ground. Mackenzie's gun went off, but the bullet went harmlessly into the air as he stumbled backward, clutching his wounded leg. Jackson was moving before the echo of the gunshot had faded, diving toward his rifle while drawing his Colt with his other hand. The final confrontation lasted only seconds. Mackenzie, wounded and off balance, tried to bring his gun to bear on Jackson, but the bounty hunter was faster. His Colt spoke twice, both bullets finding their mark in the center of Mackenzie's chest. The outlaw leader looked surprised for just a moment before collapsing to the dusty street. Jackson was beside Catalina before Mackenzie hit the ground, pulling her into his arms and holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands running over her arms and face, checking for injuries. "I'm fine," she gasped, clinging to him just as desperately. "I knew you would save me. I knew you wouldn't let him hurt me." "You saved yourself," Jackson said, his voice rough with emotion. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Around them, the townspeople were emerging from their hiding places, tending to the wounded and making sure the remaining outlaws were securely tied up. The immediate danger was over, but Jackson knew that word of this battle would spread throughout the territory. Other men with grudges might come looking for him, and the cycle of violence could continue indefinitely. But as he held Catalina in, his arms feeling her heart beating against his chest, Jackson realized that he no longer cared about the dangers that might come. He had found something worth fighting for, something worth living for. And for the first time since losing his first family, he believed he might actually have a future worth looking forward to. 6 months after the battle that had nearly destroyed Cedar Falls, the town had not only recovered, but had begun to prosper in ways no one had expected. Word of how the townspeople had stood together against the McKinsey gang had spread throughout the territory, bringing new families and businesses to the growing community. The railroad had even announced plans to extend a spur line to Cedar Falls, ensuring its future is more than just another frontier settlement. Jackson stood on the porch of the house he had built on the hill overlooking the town, watching the sun set over the valley he now called home. The house was modest, but well constructed, with a wide front porch and large windows that Catalina had insisted upon so she could watch the town below while she worked on her sewing. Behind him, he could hear her humming softly as she prepared their evening meal, sound that never failed to bring a smile to his face. The transition from bounty hunter to settled man had not been easy. For months after the battle, Jackson had struggled with the restlessness that came from staying in one place for too long. He had been accustomed to constant movement, to the solitary life of a man who owned nothing more than he could carry on horseback. But gradually, as spring had turned to summer and summer to fall, he had discovered the deep satisfaction that came from building something lasting. Sheriff Crawford had offered him a position as deputy, which Jackson had accepted after much consideration. The work was different from bounty hunting, focused more on keeping the peace than tracking down killers, but it suited his new desire for stability. He still carried his guns and knew how to use them, but now he used those skills to protect a community rather than simply to survive. The sound of approaching footsteps on the porch made Jackson turned from his contemplation of the sunset. Catalina emerged from the house, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the blue dress he had bought her for her birthday last month. Even after all these months together, the sight of her still made his breath catch in his throat. "Penny, for your thoughts," she said, settling beside him on the wooden bench they had placed at one end of the porch. "Just thinking about how much things have changed," Jackson replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "A year ago, I never would have believed I could be this happy." Catalina smiled and leaned against his shoulder, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing for both of them. "Do you ever regret giving up the bounty hunting?" Jackson considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked him about his past life. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had kept running," he admitted. "But then I look at what we have here, what we've built together, and I know I made the right choice." "Even when the restlessness comes?" Catalina asked perceptively. She had learned to read his moods better than anyone ever had, understanding when the old urges to move on would surface. Even then, Jackson confirmed. "Besides, there's still plenty of adventure to be had right here in Cedar Falls. Just last week, I had to talk old Mrs. Henderson out of shooting her neighbor's chickens for getting into her garden." Catalina laughed, the sound mixing with the evening breeze that carried the scent of wood smoke and autumn leaves. "Such a dangerous life you lead now, Deputy Cole. The most dangerous part is coming home every night to a woman who can drive sewing scissors into a man's leg without hesitation." Jackson teased, earning himself a playful swat on the arm. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching at a gallop. Both Jackson and Catalina rose from the bench, recognizing the urgency in the rider's approach. Jackson's hand automatically moved to the gun on his hip, old habits dying hard despite his new life. The rider turned out to be young Timothy Walsh, the telegraph operator's son, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. "Deputy Cole," he called out as he dismounted. "Sheriff Crawford sent me to find you. There's been a telegram from the territorial capital." Jackson accepted the folded paper with growing concern, his mind already racing through the possibilities. Had someone from his past finally tracked him down? Was there trouble coming that would threaten the peaceful life he and Catalina had built? As he read the telegram, His expression changed from concern to amazement, then to something approaching joy. Catalina watched his face anxiously, trying to read the message in his changing expressions. "What is it?" she asked finally, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Jackson looked up from the telegram, his eyes bright with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "It's from the territorial governor," he said slowly. "He's offering me the position of U.S. Marshal for this district. The pay is good, and I'd be based right here in Cedar Falls." Catalina's heart leaped with excitement and pride. A U.S. Marshal was a position of real authority and respect. Exactly the kind of legitimate law enforcement work that would allow Jackson to use his skills while maintaining the stable life they had built together. "That's wonderful," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around his neck. "You'll accept it, won't you?" Jackson held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and the subtle perfume she wore. "Only if you're sure you can handle being married to a lawman," he said quietly. It took a moment for his words to sink in, and when they did, Catalina pulled back to stare at him in shock. "Married?" she whispered. Jackson reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that he had been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. "I've been meaning to ask you properly," he said, dropping to one knee right there on the porch. "Catalina Rodriguez, will you marry me?" The ring was simple but beautiful, a small diamond set in gold that caught the last rays of the setting sun. Catalina stared at it through tears she didn't remember starting to shed, her heart so full of joy that she could barely speak. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course I'll marry you." Jackson slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then rose to sweep her into his arms and spin her around the porch. Young Timothy cleared his throat awkwardly, reminding them of his presence. "Should I tell the sheriff? You'll take the marshal job?" the boy asked with a grin. "I tell him I'll be in first thing tomorrow morning to discuss the details," Jackson replied, never taking his eyes off Catalina's face. As Timothy rode away to deliver the message, Jackson and Catalina remained on the porch, holding each other as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Below them, the lights of Cedar Falls twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a life, a family, a dream being pursued in the growing town. "So Marshal Cole," Catalina said softly, testing how the title sounded. "Do you think you can handle the responsibility of keeping the peace in a whole district?" "With the right woman beside me, I think I can handle anything," Jackson replied, tilting her chin up so he could kiss her properly as their lips met under the star-filled sky. Both of them knew that they had found something rare and precious, a love strong enough to overcome the past and brave enough to build a future. Jackson had saved Catalina's life that day on the desert road, but in the end, it was she who had saved his soul, giving him a reason not just to breathe, but to truly live. The wind carried the sound of their laughter across the valley, mixing with the distant sounds of the town settling in for the night. In the morning, there would be new challenges to face, new responsibilities to shoulder, and new adventures to share. But tonight, there was only love, the promise of all the tomorrows they would spend together. Their story had begun with violence and fear, but it would continue with hope and joy, proving that even the most wounded hearts could heal when they found their perfect match. Jackson Cole, the man who had once lived only for the next bounty, had discovered that his greatest treasure had been waiting for him in a dusty stagecoach on a desert road, and that saving her life had been the first step toward saving his own.